Hello, I'm Oliver Pooley. I'm Vice Provost at Oriel College, and therefore it's my job and pleasure on behalf of the college to welcome you all to this year's David and Lyon Lecture on the politics of sex and gender identities in diverse societies. This is the third year of this speaker series, and today we have a distinguished panel of speakers who will be discussing the topic banning LGBTQ+ conversion practices, UK and global perspectives. As you can see, we're not in Oriel, we're in the beautiful Convocation House. And as it was once the seat of Parliament, it's perhaps a suitable venue for this important topic, discussion of this important topic, as we anticipate government action in this area. I want to thank our sponsor and host, David Lyon. David read history at Oriel, and as well as being an alumnus, he's a great friend and benefactor of the college. He had a stellar career in finance and the public sector, and has also been on the front line of politics in this area as an advocate. He is now a patron of the National HIV Story Trust and a Stonewall Equality Ambassador. David has endowed a graduate scholarship at Oriel in Oxford in this area, and we are hugely grateful to him for initiating this speaker series. So in a moment we will have a pre-recorded, specially recorded presentation from our local MP and more importantly the Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, Anneliese Dodds. But before that I should introduce and hand over to our chair for this afternoon, Professor Tim Soutphommasane returned to Oxford in 2023 as Professor of Practice in Human Rights, and he's the university's first Chief Diversity Officer. So, Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Oliver, and welcome everyone to this David and Lyon Lecture. And it's a great pleasure for me to be involved this evening. And as Oliver has mentioned, we're having this conversation in light of the UK government's recent commitment to a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices, and having this conversation too on the eve of Transgender Day of Remembrance. We have a very distinguished panel to shed light on this topic of banning LGBTQ+ conversion practices with national and global perspectives, and we'll be hearing from our panel shortly about the challenges of securing LGBTQ+ rights and inclusion at what is a time of significant political polarisation. Here at the University of Oxford, we are committed to ensuring that all members of the collegiate university community, whether staff or students, enjoy equal dignity and respect. I won't say too much, but last month we did launch our first ever collegiate university equality, diversity and inclusion strategic plan. And our aspiration expressed in that plan is for this to be a place where everyone belongs and is supported to succeed, and for Oxford to strive to be a leader on equality, diversity and inclusion in society. One of our key objectives is to create and secure a culture of belonging across the institution, and when it concerns LGBTQ+ inclusion, we have, among other things, a task and finish group that is looking into how we strengthen the support that we give to LGBTQ+ students and staff. That work's being led by my colleague David Isaac, who's here this evening. Can I mention that we want to do this work in a certain way, which is to be informed by the values of curiosity and courage, and with a belief that a commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion go hand in hand with a commitment to academic freedom and free speech. We believe that it's vital that we can ask important questions and have debates on the major issues of the day, but do so with courtesy and consideration, and I hope that this is the spirit in which we'll have our conversation tonight. Before I introduce our panellists for this evening, and what will happen is you'll hear from each of them before we then open up to questions and answers. As Oliver mentioned, we have a message from Anneliese Dodds MP, Minister of State for Women and Equalities, who isn't able to join us this evening but has pre-recorded a message for us.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join your event today. Unfortunately, I can't be there in person, but I still wanted to support your event and the great work you're undertaking by sending a video message instead. Let me begin by saying that first and foremost, LGBT+ rights are a priority for our government. The last time Labour was in power, we advanced those rights, scrapping Section 28 and introducing civil partnerships. This time, we will go further in protecting LGBT+ communities. Over 27,000 hate crimes motivated by sexual orientation and transgender status were recorded by police in England and Wales in the year ending March 2024. We shouldn't forget that behind every statistic is a real person who, like you and me, wishes to live their life without fear of discrimination. The human impact of hatred is at the forefront of my mind, fueling my commitment as Minister for Women and Equalities to foster an inclusive society where LGBT+ people can thrive, be themselves, and feel respected. While we should feel incredibly proud about the progress we've made to advance the rights and protections for LGBT+ people across the UK, it's incumbent on us not to be complacent and to build on those solid foundations. I'm pleased to say that this work is already underway, including our manifesto commitments to equalise all existing strands of hate crime legislation, and we're working to deliver a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices, as set out in the government's First King's speech. We will improve the lives of LGBT+ people in our country and internationally, restoring the UK's reputation as a beacon of fairness and equality on the world stage, and setting an example for our global counterparts to follow. Now is the time for action, not words. Now is the time to convene, not divide. Promises made should be promises kept, and we will deliver our pledge to consign the recent politics of division to the past. Actively engaging with LGBT+ people and listening to them with respect will form the cornerstone of our approach to addressing inequality and removing barriers to opportunities. I want LGBT+ people to feel represented and empowered to pursue their goals and ambitions without having to hide who they are. The 69 openly LGBT+ MPs in this Parliament, of which 45 are new, are a testament to this, but there's still much more that can and should be done. We know that progress is enabled by pulling everyone up, not by pushing the most vulnerable down. This government will promote our country's core values of tolerance and fair-mindedness, bringing people together. Finally, many LGBT+ people have walked the halls of this very university. Of course, Oscar Wilde particularly springs to mind, and many others. We owe it to them and to every other LGBT+ person who's come before to continue building a society in which the most marginalised groups are protected. Let us be the architects of a society that values and respects LGBT+ people and that acts to bring people with us to a more equal, progressive future. Thank you, and enjoy the evening.
Well, the scene is set then for our discussion. Let me introduce our distinguished panel. We have joining us Ilias Trispiotis, who is a Professor of Human Rights Law at the University of Leeds. He works on international and European human rights law, equality law and legal theory, and his research on the appropriate legal responses to conversion therapy has shaped policy conversations in the UK, Europe and New Zealand. His collection, Banning Conversion Therapy, Legal and Policy Perspectives, was published last year by Hart Bloomsbury. Next to Ilias, we have Jane Ozanne. Jane is a global voice in the contested space of religion and LGBTQ+ rights. With a background in international marketing and development, she's managed some of the world's best-known brands, and in 2020 she founded the Ban Conversion Therapy Coalition, which she chairs. and is currently a research fellow at Regent's Park College here in Oxford. And then we have Philip Ayoub. Philip is Professor in the Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy at UCL. He also serves as co-editor of the European Journal of Politics and Gender. Philip's work bridges insights from international relations and comparative politics, engaging questions of transnational politics, sexuality, gender, and social movements. I can't think of three better individuals to guide us through the question of conversion practices. And what will happen now is you'll hear from Ilias, then Jane, then Philip. They're going to share their reflections with you, and then we'll open up to questions and answers. Please join me in welcoming Ilias.
Thank you. Many thanks for the invitation, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. My contribution will focus on why the UK has a legal duty to ban all conversion practices without exceptions. Before talking about this legal duty, it's important to define what conversion practices are. The UN Human Rights Council defines conversion therapy, or the less problematic term conversion practices, as an umbrella term that includes several different practices aimed at changing or suppressing a person's sexual orientation or gender identity because, and this is a crucial element of the definition, because they're not perceived as desirable. The Memorandum of Understanding against Conversion Therapy, which has been signed by the NHS and the BACP, among many other leading authorities in the UK, adopts a similar definition. According to the MOU, the discriminatory presumptions that underlie all conversion practices is what distinguishes those practices from ethical practices. Ethical practices are free from any predetermined purpose or agenda that favours one gender identity or sexual orientation as preferable over other gender and sexual diversities. Ethical practices acknowledge that there is a broad spectrum of sexual orientations and gender identities and expressions and aim to provide acceptance and support to a person. Very similar definitions of conversion practices have been adopted by the many countries which have chosen to ban those practices in recent years. Examples are Canada, France, Germany, Norway, Malta, Greece, New Zealand, several Australian territories, among many others. The UN Human Rights Council and the UN Committee Against Torture both have called for a global ban on conversion practices. It's really encouraging to hear the message by Anneliese Dodds tonight. You might still be wondering, though, why it's taken so long in the UK to ban conversion practices, despite the fact that there is incontrovertible evidence that those practices can cause grave harm to LGBT people, and there is also incontrovertible evidence that those practices do not work. When so many countries have banned conversion practices, are there any good reasons we haven't done that yet? So to understand a bit better where we are, let me briefly discuss two arguments against banning conversion therapy, before moving to why a ban is required. The first argument against banning conversion practices is that new legislation is redundant. Existing laws are sufficient to protect LGBT people from the harms of conversion practices. Let me put this as clearly as possible. This argument is incorrect. Existing laws are not adequate to protect people from conversion therapies in the UK. Let me give you a few specific examples. Tort law provisions allow someone to seek damages for harmful medical practices. However, the tort of negligence cannot cover most cases of so-called talking conversion practices. Why is this the case? Well, claimants hoping to sue using the tort of negligence need to demonstrate four things. They have to demonstrate that they suffered actionable damage, that the defendant owed them a duty of care, the defendant breached that duty of care, and that the breach caused the damage. So 4 things. None of those 4 things would be possible for most so-called talking conversion practices. First of all, a claimant would need to demonstrate that they have suffered from a recognized psychiatric injury. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to demonstrate that they suffered actionable damage. Now, many examples of grievous psychological harm, or even posing a grave risk to someone's psychological health, are not recognized psychiatric injuries. So most likely, the extremely serious and very well evidenced harm that talking conversion practices can cause would fail to meet the threshold requirement for actionable damage by the tort of negligence. But for the sake of the argument, let's assume that the specific talking therapy did cause a recognized psychiatric injury to someone. Even if that happened, that person, that claimant, would need to show, on top of that, that the defendant owed them a duty of care to avoid causing the injury. Now, proving that the medical professional has a duty of care towards a patient is straightforward. But proving that an amateur therapist, like a faith healer, has a duty to provide care of a certain standard is much more complicated. Remember, the vast majority of professional organisations in the UK, including the NHS, are opposed to conversion practices. Conversion practices cannot be commissioned on the NHS. This provides evidence that those practices are negligent. But here is the rub. Most providers of conversion therapy in the UK are not registered professionals, they're amateurs. This matters because the tort of negligence, according to the tort of negligence, therapists must meet the standard of the reasonable person placed in their position. Simply put, if conversion therapists hold themselves out to be psychiatrists, they will have to meet the standard of the reasonable psychiatrist. If they present as unqualified faith healers, then the standard will be that of the unqualified faith healer. In other words, the tort of negligence holds pseudoscience to a lower standard than orthodox medicine. The fact that there's evidence showing that conversion practices are greatly harmful doesn't mean that the standard of care that non-professional practitioners owe to claimants changes. It doesn't change. And the same is true of many alternative or complementary therapies or medicine. So, the tort of negligence cannot protect people from most talking conversion practices. How about the law on harassment, which has been suggested as another avenue? Well, I'm afraid that wouldn't be helpful either. Harassment protects people from conduct that is unwelcome or unwanted. If an individual seeks out conversion therapy, it will be hard for them to argue that providing them with it constitutes harassment. That applies to harassment as defined both under the Protection of Harassment Act 1997 and by the Equality Act 2010. Both refer to unwanted or unwelcome conduct. So, bottom line, in the UK, existing tort law is not adequate to protect people from the harms of conversion practices. How about criminal law? Criminal law presents us with similar challenges to the ones I just discussed with you. Criminal law provisions, of course, can protect individuals from any practice that cause serious bodily or psychiatric harms. However, the reach of criminal law in the case of consensual practices or in the case of practices which cause serious harm but not a recognized psychiatric injury, or in the case of practices that cause serious harm, including a recognized psychiatric injury, but in the long term, not immediately. And conversion therapy practices are evidently practices that cause harm in the long run. The reach of criminal law in those cases is much more limited. As a result, to wrap up this point, it's not correct to argue that banning conversion practices is superfluous because existing laws are protective enough. I said I will take you through two arguments against banning conversion practices in the UK. I've only discussed one so far. The second argument against banning conversion practices is that doing so could violate the right to freedom of religion or belief. I know that Jane will cover religious conversion practices to some extent, so I will only add one point here based on my area of expertise. Freedom to manifest religion or belief in public is a core aspect of the right to freedom of religion. But this part of the right is not an absolute right, it's a qualified right. That means that limitations on religious expression are legitimate under certain circumstances, such as when those limitations are necessary to protect the rights of others. None of us can use our rights, none of our rights, to destroy the rights of other people. That's not allowed in human rights law, and Article 17 of the ECHR called Abuse of Rights is an example of that. And that's why the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion or Belief confirmed in 2021 that the right to religious freedom cannot justify offering conversion practices. There is consensus about this point in international human rights law. However, I don't want to argue just that banning conversion practices is compatible with human rights law. Banning conversion practices is required by human rights law. The UK is under duty to do so. I've argued that point extensively in my published work, and there is significant support for this position in international human rights law and by international human rights law bodies. So why is there a duty to ban all forms of conversion practices? It's because all such practices amount at a minimum to degrading treatment. Some of you might know that in UK law and in international law, the prohibition of torture, inhuman or degrading treatment is absolute. No exceptions are allowed under any circumstances. Because of how important this prohibition is, states are under a positive legal obligation to take any action they can, including legal action, in order to protect everyone from torture, inhuman or degrading treatment. So the question is, why all conversion practices fall within the scope of this prohibition? This is because all conversion practices combine two serious moral wrongs. The first is that all conversion practices put LGBT people at a proved, real risk of grave harm, psychological or physical. The second moral wrong is that all such practices directly discriminate on the grounds of sexuality or gender identity. They typically single out LGBT people to harm them by denying them key freedoms. Because of this distinctive combination of serious harm and direct discrimination, all conversion practices amount at the minimum to degrading treatment in international human rights law. As I said, there is a lot of support for this position. Whenever direct discrimination underlies or motivates ill treatment, that is an aggravating factor. This means that whenever ill treatment is motivated by discrimination, it will reach the threshold of torture, inhuman or degrading treatment, even if it might not have reached that threshold otherwise. There are many examples of how this combination of serious harm and direct discrimination gives rise to a violation of the prohibition of degrading treatment. The case law of the European Court of Human Rights includes a series of cases involving, for example, unnecessary strip searches in airports, or cases where LGBT people were verbally abused in public, but the police did nothing in response. In all those cases, the European Court of Human Rights found a violation of Article 3 of the Convention, which prohibits torture, inhuman or degrading treatment, even though none of those examples involved ill treatment that caused sustained injury or sustained suffering. It is for the very same reason, because all conversion practices combine serious harm with direct discrimination, that all of them would reach the threshold of Article 3. Now, all this is enough to generate a positive state obligation to ban conversion practices. This obligation flows from the absolute prohibition of torture and human degrading treatment. That's why a ban is not just compatible with human rights law, it's required by human rights law. It's worth noting here that the UN Committee Against Torture has reached the same conclusion. In recent periodic reports from China and from Ecuador, the UNCAT called on those states to outlaw conversion therapies alongside, and I quote, all abusive treatments targeting LGBT people. This statement by the UNCAT is important, not only because it demonstrates that all forms of conversion practices fall within the prohibition of torture and human degrading treatment, but also because the UNCAT did not just focus on forcible forms of conversion practices. The UNCAT said that all abusive practices targeting LGBT people have to be clearly outlawed. Which brings me to consent. Can people offer valid consent to conversion practices? To be valid in law, consent must meet two requirements. It must be informed and must be voluntary. Let's start with informed. According to the Care Quality Commission, informed consent means that the person must be given all of the information about what the therapy involves, including the short and longer term risks. Think about this for a moment. Informed consent in this context would require the quote-unquote therapist to tell the recipient that there is extensive scientific evidence that conversion therapies are gravely harmful and that they do not work. It's difficult to imagine a situation where a therapist would or could offer that information. In fact, most people interviewed in the UK for the previous government's own commissioned research on conversion practices said that they were not given accurate information about the risks of conversion practices, nor were they offered an alternative. But here is a rub. Even if a provider of a conversion practice did offer this information, evidence shows that many LGBT people would still consent to go through those practices, often out of fear of exclusion or rejection from their communities. This takes us to the second requirement of valid consent. It has to be voluntary. Voluntary here means that the decision to consent must be made by the person and not be influenced by others. However, truly voluntary consent is not possible here. Conversion practices do not take place in a vacuum. Conversion practices take place in the context of historical stigmatization of LGBT people, and always involve a strikingly asymmetrical power relationship between quote-unquote therapists that can fix you and individuals in distress. Both the historical point and the power asymmetry point matter in law. Both those points in combination demonstrate the enormous pressure on LGBT people to question or resist their identities. Truly voluntary consent is not possible in this context, and crucially, the law recognizes the limits of consent in such situations. Think about this from a different angle. For all the reasons we've discussed, because of its degrading nature, because it builds on social stigma, because it involves a power imbalance, so-called conversion therapy is very closely analogous to coercive controlling behaviour in UK law. Jonathan Herring, who is a professor here at Oxford, has made that point, and others have too. As many of you will know, coercive controlling behaviour includes acts of humiliation or intimidation that cause distress to a person. In a relationship of coercive control, perpetrators typically gaslight victims into blaming themselves for any abuse they suffer, or into believing that the abuse might be beneficial for them. Coercive controlling behaviour in the context of domestic abuse is a criminal offence in the UK, regardless of whether someone consented to it. The same should be true of conversion practices. To conclude, I think that it's important to understand the reasons why the UK is under a legal and a moral duty to ban all forms of conversion practices without exemptions. Of course, a legal ban cannot in itself eradicate those practices or offer sufficient protection to LGBT people. We know that additional measures outside of the law ought to be taken. That doesn't make a legal ban on conversion practices any less necessary, though. A legal ban on conversion practices carries great practical power, but also great expressive power for victims and survivors of conversion practices and for LGBT communities in the UK and all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Anneliese. You've given us the legal background and the legal context there. Now to hear, as we focus our attention now on the UK experience and context and the role of religion, Jane Ozane.
Thank you. I'm going to take my speaker's prerogative for a moment. These pews look very much like pews to me. And do you want to just take a minute just to move and stand for a second? Because otherwise we're not going to hear a word I'm going to say. And, sorry. You may find it a little more comfortable at the back if you need a backrest. Sorry. Now I've all won you over.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ilias. If I may, I'm going to carry on. Not only for your excellent and incisive overview of the main legal aspects relating to conversion practices, but also for your wisdom, tenacity and professionalism over the years that we've worked together on this. I must say, without your support, I wouldn't have had the courage to take on the government by forming the Ban Conversion Therapy Coalition. Nor would I have had the confidence to form the Ban Conversion Therapy Legal Forum, of which you are a critical part. This has brought together an extraordinary group of international human rights lawyers, and including Richard Bangaroo, who's here, actually, perhaps who helped us write something called the Cooper Report, and which was chaired by Baroness Helena Kennedy. We'll hear more from the Legal Forum in a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, banning conversion practices is not hard. Indeed, the Canadian government chose to do so in an afternoon. However, for various reasons here in the UK, all political, we have now taken over 6 years. Indeed, it's over 7 years since I led a debate in the Church of England that successfully outlawed these abusive practices in our churches. This naturally begs 3 questions. Why has it taken so long? What, if anything, has now changed? And will we finally, after 3 King/Queen speeches, get to see a full ban? I certainly hope so. And I believe the British public do too. Indeed, many, I would suggest, believe that it was banned years ago, and so cannot understand why Parliament has dragged its feet so slowly, emboldening perpetrators and continuing to cause significant harm to LGBT people, the majority of whom, research tells us, are children and young adults. As far back as July 2020, my foundation commissioned an independent YouGov survey to gauge the public mood on whether conversion therapy should be banned, particularly amongst those with a religious belief. To be fair, conversion therapy was not that understood as a concept, with nearly a quarter saying, "I don't know." However, over 60% agreed that conversion therapy should be banned, with only 14% saying no. And this was backed by research by Kantar later that year, indicating very similar figures. Arguably, much does rest on the definition of conversion therapy, which, let us be clear, is far from a form of therapy. And that's why we've encouraged the move to the broader, more accurate term, conversion practices. As Ilias has explained, the definition that the Ban Conversion Therapy Legal Forum has proposed is any practice with a predetermined purpose that seeks to change, cure, or suppress a person's sexuality or gender identity. It is the predetermined mindset or intent of the person conducting the act that is the problem, particularly when there is a power differential between the parties. The outcome is already set. That is, that the individual who is experiencing the practice must change or suppress their nature, as it is unacceptable for them to be gay, trans, or non-binary. This is normally because of an ideological or religious reason held by the perpetrator and sometimes by the individual, which research shows is most likely to be by a religious leader, a healthcare professional, or a parent. So why hasn't it been banned? Why is the UK so far behind the rest of the international community on this, and will this now change? Well, the short answer is that there has, under the former government, been a distinct lack of political will. And yes, as we heard from Anneliese Dodds, I believe that has now changed. Labour committed to a full inclusive ban on conversion practices in their manifesto, and this was echoed in the King's speech in last July, and I believe we will see a draft bill very shortly. However, those opposed to a bill are still very vocal and are likely to try and thwart its progress. Whilst it will undoubtedly get through the House of Commons, its passage through the House of Lords will be challenging and, frankly, I suspect, quite unpleasant. That is why it will be important for the bill to receive proper scrutiny in an open forum, such as the Women and Equalities Select Committee, where the arguments of those who are determined to undermine this critical legislation can be dealt with head-on, and survivors' voices prioritised. As we saw with the debate enabled by Russell Moyle's private members' Conversion Practices Prohibition Bill in March earlier this year, there are still those who are totally ideologically opposed to any legislation in this area. Lloyd had succeeded in a way that no one till then had in presenting a bill that had gained exceptionally broad consensus. He had met with virtually all those who were both for and against these practices and had put forward a solution that, whilst not perfect, was a reasonable and rational way forward. It failed for two reasons. The government, for political reasons, withdrew their support, and so allowed those with ideological reasons to filibuster, and thus ensured the debate was talked out of time. The political reasons have been well rehearsed in the media and centre around the desire to use LGBT people's lives, particularly trans people's lives, as a political wedge issue in a toxic culture war, which the former government saw fit to wage. The former Minister for Women and Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, now leader of the opposition, has herself said, most notably in her final appearance in front of the Women and Equalities Select Committee in December, if it was just LGB, the bill would probably have been legislation by now. It is the T that complicates it. And as part of her oral testimony, she explained that one of the complications she had in relation to banning conversion practices was defining gender identity, a problem which none of other countries around the world who have successfully banned this appears to have encountered. She then also set out two other issues. One, the fear of criminalising medical professionals, and two, the fear of criminalising parents. It is interesting to note here that the Memorandum of Understanding group that brings together over 25 healthcare, counselling and psychotherapy organisations, including the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the NHS, the Royal College of Psychotherapy and the UK Council for Psychotherapy, all support a full ban on conversion practices. Any fears relating to criminalising people due to their conversations with young LGBT people are unfounded, as these medical professions have themselves recognised, so long as the definition regarding predetermined purposes apply. Questioning, challenging, exploring these complex issues relating to sexuality and identity are all to be encouraged. The issue arises when they are conducted in such a way that the outcome is already predetermined. The same argument can be applied to parents and indeed to religious leaders. All conversations that seek to challenge and explore are good and proper. However, when actions are taken to ensure a set outcome, then the law needs to provide a clear line of what is and is not acceptable. Research has shown that these harmful actions can consist of spoken words, supposed therapeutic sessions, prayers, but they can equally consist of physical acts such as violence, food deprivation, enforcing certain types of clothing, and sadly even forced rape. And we must remember that the Children's Act 1989 sets out that children have rights too and must be protected from harm and the risk of harm. Indeed, their local authority has a duty under Section 47 of the Act to investigate where children are at risk of significant harm. It may be worth remembering here that those who were most opposed to the legislation at the time that it was being introduced were certain religious groups who wanted to be able to discipline their children. The smacking ban, as it came to be known, was a necessary piece of legislation that sought to protect children from physical violence, and I believe there is a deep relevance here. One of the other myths circulating in political settings is that the prevalence of conversion practices isn't very high, and that few undergo it today. And whilst it's difficult to get an accurate figure, not least because those who are currently going through it rarely speak out or understand that that is what they're actually experiencing, we do have certain facts to point to. Firstly, the previous government's own research showed in their landmark LGBT survey that 2% of LGBT people surveyed had undergone conversion therapy and a further 5% had been offered it. This was significantly higher amongst the trans community. And it's always been my contention that these figures significantly underplay the real prevalence of conversion practices, as many did not understand that this was not confined to just counselling sessions, but also included actions by religious leaders such as prayer. Now, a recent survey by the Trevor Project in the UK concurs with this. The research was conducted earlier this year amongst nearly 10,000 young LGBT people aged between 13 and 24, of whom 1 in 6, that's 16%, said that they'd been threatened with or subject to conversion therapy. The results of this survey are truly shocking, particularly the fact that over half of those questioned, 58%, had seriously attempted suicide. And sadly, this concurs with my own foundation's research that shows significant impact on LGBT people's mental health after undertaking conversion practices. Nearly 1 in 3 had attempted suicide. 1 in 3. And 2/3 had contemplated it. Perhaps, though, the most prescient indicator this remains a pressing issue today is the take-up of the Gallup helpline for survivors of conversion practices, which was one initiative that the previous administration did implement. And Gallup have commissioned their own report that shows 1 in 5% of LGBT people under 24 have been subjected to conversion practices. It certainly still occurs today. I would suggest, therefore, that the main political reasons for delaying the introduction of a ban have, in fact, been driven by ideology more than by fact, and that ideology has been twofold. Firstly, the recent focus on trans healthcare by those who would have us believe, amongst other things, that young lesbians are being forced to become trans. It may sound quite fanciful, but sadly so much of the trans debate actually is. One of the greatest failures of the previous government was their refusal to meet with trans people themselves, to listen to their lived experience, especially when it came to being subjected to conversion practices. The rapid rise in hate crime against the trans community has sadly been a direct result of the media war that's been waged against them. I feel terribly inadequate speaking here for my trans siblings, but I do hope that the new government will prioritise listening and engaging with them, as they know firsthand the damage that is being done and what would help to address it. Secondly, there's a push back from the religious right who wish to be able to continue to pray the gay away. As many of you know, this is an area of which I have had some considerable experience, having voluntarily consented, I believe, for over 20 years of what I now recognise as conversion practices. This took me through the 3 distinct stages of conversion practices as I categorise them. Firstly, the silent phase, where I carried a secret that I dare not tell anyone, as I feared being rejected and ostracised by my friends, family, and religious leaders. It's a secret that nearly killed me, when I ended up in hospital with my body cracking under the physical strain and stress and the internal torment. I was an adult at the time. It is far, far harder for young LGBT teenagers who live in fear of being found out or being outed. I voluntarily chose to undergo conversion practices, which is what I define as the second stage, where I started to confide in people who I trusted and who in return sought to pray with and for me in the expectation that I would be healed. Their love and kindness was palpable, but so also was the clear message that who I am, a gay woman who so longed to love and be loved, was unacceptable and sinful. In many churches, one is told one's eternal salvation is at stake. The feelings of shame and self-hatred which I bore for over 20 years were quite simply crucifying. The prayer did not work, as much as I longed for it to do so. I therefore sought, as many do in stage 3, for professional help, where I spent thousands seeking deliverance or exorcisms and paying Christian counsellors to help me determine why I was gay. There had to be a reason, something I'd done perhaps or undergone. Sadly, this too didn't work, and I ended up yet again in hospital, yet again fighting for my life. I survived. Many don't. Informed consent can never be freely given in these scenarios, as Ilias has explained. There will always be coercion, no matter how well-intentioned. And banning conversion practices using both civil and criminal legislation is the first step towards ending these abusive practices. I'm not going to go through the package of measures we need, but we need whistleblowing measures, we need to track perpetrators, we need help supporting victims, and we need a prohibition both on advertising and printing and disseminating materials, as well as sending people outside our own borders for conversion practices. It is not just about a ban. Ladies and gentlemen, it's long past time that the UK made good its pledge to protect LGBT people from harm. We must recognise the harm that these practices cause, and indeed have caused during all the years we've prevaricated. And as such, we must put survivors' voices front of centre of all that we do when we're discussing elements of an effective ban. This is something the previous government singularly failed to do, and it is the one thing I look to this government to do differently. As then, just about then, we might get a ban that will help re-establish us as a safer place for LGBT people in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here today, especially with my colleagues here to talk about this very important issue. My job is to widen the lens a little bit, not least because you have two of the leading experts in conversion practices here with us today, but also because my work more specifically looks at the spread of LGBT rights internationally and also, unfortunately, the growing resistance to them in international spaces, which I think also makes this topic very important. So what I'll try to do in my time here is to talk a little bit about growing threats around LGBT rights globally, looking at the emergence of an increasingly transnationalized global movement, touching on who comprises it, and also what their claims are and what that means for LGBT rights as a response. Let me first just start, though, by acknowledging that what we have witnessed in the last decades has been remarkable and unprecedented successes around LGBT rights, which I think is part of this conversation and something that we very much need to celebrate, that issues that were seen as radical or unthinkable not long ago have become common practice in many of our countries, including the ones we have here. Marriage equality, full marriage rights have only been around for a little over 20 years and at the turn of the century, and now are seen commonplace. Many of my students think we've had them for much longer than we've actually had them. And a lot of those successes were spread also through innovative transnational tools that movement actors and colleagues and professors have worked across borders to help establish. Queer people have actually worked across borders since the 1800s, formalizing institutions that would help spread new ideas and innovations that would change the world as we know it. A lot of countries that have followed and moved on LGBT rights have been influenced by some of these transnational dynamics. That's the hard work of transnational advocacy organizations, certain states that support those advocacy organizations, and also international organizations like the courts that Elias mentioned that introduce certain precedents and standards. And when states, or when countries reach a certain threshold of rights, sometimes an issue will be propelled and happen elsewhere. There are 16 countries that have banned conversion practices already, which I think makes the feeling of urgency all the more great in countries that have not. Yet while we can marvel at some of the successes of transnational movements around LGBTI rights, we must also reckon with the reality at this moment that there is substantial pushback against the accomplishments that have been won. The massive expansion of LGBT rights in the last 30 years, especially in Europe, comes against a backdrop of notable crises of rights that play into the nationalist and populist moment that we live in. There are a lot of new kinds of innovations against rights that also spread across borders. We can think of, bans against so-called gay propaganda, which might exist in places like Russia or Hungary and diffuse across borders. We can see politicians talking about the threat of, drag queen story hour, where you see similar rhetoric, whether in the state of Florida or in Bavaria or in Brazil. And a lot of my work more recently has looked at how some of the same transnational tools that we have attributed to the success of LGBT rights are also increasingly used by their opponents in a resistance to those rights. And what my colleague Christina Stöckel and our new book argue is that these resistances have employed many of these same tools, these transnational tools that garnered LGBTI people their widespread recognition, but that their emergence also creates new challenges for LGBT rights groups and for LGBT people. These resistances are built off a long history of moral conservative narratives and institutional infrastructure that unites very ideologically incongruent and also geographically scattered actors around perceived threats often related to gender and sexuality. Even if the threats might take different shapes in different domestic contexts, LGBT people feature very, very centrally in them that have put us on I think, the agenda in many different places. The emergence of this transnational movement against LGBT rights is puzzling for the field of political science, but also for observers more generally in a few different ways. One is that we had thought of the global networks that lead to rights promotion very much the domain of progressive groups. So a lot of the ideas around around transnational advocacy, we're really seeing human rights advocates using them and not so much the opponents using them, but that is increasingly changing. It also is a puzzle given the idea around post-material modernity and cosmopolitan secularism being on a steady march of things getting better, feels challenged in this moment where we see other groups opposing those rights also occupying quite a bit of space in this work around issues that they're concerned about around traditional values that are also rolling back those rights in many places. And then finally, there's an interesting issue that I have to admit was also quite surprising for me in this work, is that nationalism always excluded LGBT people in a very central way and led to opposition to LGBT rights everywhere in the domestic space. But we always thought that nationalism would be more of an impediment towards the cooperation, the transnational cooperation that we see now among some anti-LGBT warriors. The idea that LGBT people work across borders is less surprising. I mean, lots of queer people, a queer lesbian woman in Poland might have something in common with a queer Danish woman. You know, building those links across borders based on a shared experience of coming out or can be quite easy, but the idea that nationalists also work together across borders, which many of the people in this movement that I chart is more surprising and creates, I think, a new terrain of anti-LGBT activism that we're confronted with. So who are these actors? Who are the key groups surrounding these oppositions to LGBT rights? So these organizations involve a variety of groups. One of the main ones that we study in our research is called the International Organization of the Family, which organize World Congress of Family events. These are gatherings that bring together activist groups from around the world, from all regions, to talk about how to protect what they conceive of as the natural or biological family, and where LGBT people feature very centrally. There are many other networks like Citizen Go, which is a digital transnational advocacy network that includes 12 million registered subscribers, and they promote political petitions on all sorts of issues, including in defense of conversion practices in a variety of different states that are translated. Pretty much the same petition will be translated, and then we'll have its members also levy pressure on their governments around these anti-LGBT issues. There's a variety of other groups as well, but it was really fascinating to see the kind of international and transnational dimension to them in some of our research. One example is the World Congress of Families event that happened in Tbilisi in 2016, where we were conducting research. And it was on May 17th, which many of us in this room might know as the International Day Against Homo, Trans, and Biphobia. But in Georgia, by decree of the Patriarch, that day it was a holiday, became a holiday named Family Day. And there was this event. It was opened by many speakers who were talking about LGBT rights, including a Frenchman who opened the event by stating that he was the father of 7 children, before continuing to say that his country was an example of how the quote-unquote gay lobby was conquering Europe. He said, despite the resistance of the majority of our population, the government legalized gay marriage. That had happened in 2012. Then he said, my dear Georgian friends, resist the gay agenda. It wants to destroy your families. These groups are creating settings to discuss ideas, including policy innovations that diffuse across borders. The main claim that drives a lot of this mobilization is around a fear or a constructed threat around so-called gender ideology, which is a bundle of issues related to women's reproductive rights, changes in gender roles, the expansion of partnership recognition for queer people, new reproductive technologies, sex education, gender mainstreaming, protection against gender violence, and increasingly centrally, also against trans inclusion. These threats are reshaped, or this threat of gender ideology, to all sorts of issues that come to be connected to national political debates and take different shapes in different places, but do propose a set of issues or a set of policy topics that we see proliferating across countries with rapidity, with speed and suddenness. You can for example, new waves of draconian laws across many continents that even want to limit relationship recognition and punish it with severe crimes that we see in Africa, for example. So with the emergence of this movement that is increasingly moving from the domestic space to the transnational space, what does that mean for LGBT movements that have been operating at a variety of these levels, including international levels, for a long time? And here there's really interesting, I think, innovative ways that LGBT movements have always been used to confronting new resistances with agility. And what they've been doing here is rethinking about how we talk about LGBT rights in very, in sometimes surprising ways, but very interesting ways. So for example, I was, the same year that we were in Tbilisi, I was at a conference in Nicosia called Reclaiming Family Values. It was very much like Tbilisi in the sense that it had advocacy organizations from around the world taking part. to talk about how we, the LGBT movement, are actually a family rights movement. We care about children, queer children. We care about also the children of queer couples who might be stigmatized in certain ways. We have new conceptions of family as safe spaces and interesting dimensions of rainbow families that have been constructed. So as one of the Irish activists said, we're here to take the wind out of the sails of our opposition. We are the family rights movement. There are all sorts of other interesting, rooted new dimensions and frames that LGBT movements use. There's more of a call to talk about rooted national frames, to not fully scrap the global human rights frames that got us so far, but also to recognize that sometimes we have to talk in more indigenous languages to defang the arguments that we are a foreign imposition or a neo-colonial movement. There's more national frames, and there's also more religious frames in LGBT organizing that recognizes, of course, that there are many religious members of our community, but also thinks of ways to communicate and destabilize the notion that LGBT rights movements are somehow at odds with religious people. And so sometimes you might have a pride parade that takes place under the motto of a Bible verse, like love thy neighbor in certain countries, or you have all sorts of innovations that try to center that LGBT people are not in opposition to what this anti-LGBT movement claims we are in opposition to. I think, I know we're short on time, so I will come to a conclusion just now in a second, but I think that, observing the effectiveness of this movement, the fact that there are actually a growth of anti-LGBT policies proliferating, that there are debates, for example, like the one around trans inclusion that also happens in the UK, that borrows actively from these anti-LGBT groups, is an issue of concern for us that we have to think about as a movement quite seriously, and it does make the urgency of a ban on conversion practices still very much necessary, and one in the broader context that we have to take seriously into consideration, given that we're not on a steady path of things getting better and better. We have plateaus in attitudes, we have plateaus in rights. It's a difficult time ahead. Not one that is insurmountable, but nonetheless one that has to be taken very seriously. And I really appreciate getting to be with my colleagues here as part of that effort. Thank you.